One morning, a woman I'd never seen before walked up like she owned the place, because according to her, she did. Said the HOA president, her sister had officially transferred my lake cabin to her. Not sold, gifted. And she'd already planned to turn it into a headquarters for the community. Meetings, signs, renovations all happening on my land. No one asked or warned me. What started as confusion turned into something much darker. There's a reason they wanted this spot. And trust me, nothing was accidental. Drop a comment if you've ever dealt with entitled neighbors. You're not going to believe what happened next. I was halfway through fixing a loose hinge on my screen door when a white SUV skidded to a halt in my gravel driveway. A woman in designer sunglasses stepped out holding a folder like it was a court order. I didn't know her name yet, but she already had a key to my cabin. The morning sun was just creeping over the water, casting those long golden shadows through the pine trees that made me fall in love with this place. I'd been looking forward to a peaceful weekend of maintenance work, maybe some fishing later if the weather held up. The hammering rhythm had been therapeutic, just me, my tools, and the peaceful sounds of the lake lapping against the shore. She had this confident stride that immediately put me on edge, waving around what looked like official paperwork above her head, like some kind of victory flag. Her sunglasses were expensive, the kind that cost more than most people spend on groceries in a month, and her outfit screamed money and entitlement. Before I could even set down my hammer or offer a polite greeting, she announced that Barbara Henderson, our HOA president, had officially donated my cabin as the new community headquarters. The words hit me like a bucket of ice water. I'm not even sure why I didn't laugh out loud at first. Maybe it was the way she said it so matter-of-fact, like she was reading me the weather forecast. There was this absolute certainty in her voice that made me wonder if I'd somehow missed a major life event. This woman introduced herself as Emily Henderson, Barbara's sister, and she immediately started walking around my property like she was conducting a real estate appraisal. She pulled out her phone and began taking pictures of everything, narrating her renovation plans, about paint colors and where the community bulletin board would go. I stood there holding my hammer, trying to process the surreal nature of what was happening, because honestly, it felt like I'd stepped into some alternate reality where property rights didn't exist. Emily kept going on about how the cabin would be perfect for neighborhood meetings, and how she'd already called someone about getting new locks installed on Monday morning. She had this dreamy planning voice like she was describing her ideal wedding venue. Was I being pranked filmed? I actually scanned the tree line for a hidden camera crew. No such luck. Emily seemed genuinely excited about her plans, discussing room layouts and furniture arrangements with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for people who'd just purchased their dream home. This wasn't malicious vandalism or obvious criminal behavior that I could easily identify. This was someone who honestly believed she had every legal right to be planning major renovations on my property, which made the whole situation even more disturbing and confusing. That's when Barbara Henderson herself appeared, around the corner of my cabin, like she'd been waiting for her cue, and let me tell you, she looked like she'd stepped directly out of a Fortune 500 corporate boardroom. Short blonde bob haircut, perfectly styled, despite the early morning hour, bright red blazer that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, and she was carrying a clipboard, like it was some kind of weapon she'd been professionally trained to wield. The clipboard had multiple pages of official-looking documents, and she held it at just the right angle so I could see there were legal letterheads and official stamps on several pages. The way she crossed my porch without hesitation wasn't just arrogance, it was pure entitlement, as if the space already belonged to her. Barbara confirmed everything Emily had said, using this incredibly patronizing tone, like she was explaining basic mathematics to a kindergartner who'd missed too many classes. She told me this was an official HOA decision made for the community's benefit, and that I needed to cooperate immediately because I clearly didn't understand how HOA governance worked in situations involving community resource allocation. Looking back, I should have recognized right then that something much bigger was happening, but I was still trying to wrap my head around the basic insanity of the situation. I just pointed to the carved nameplate above the doorframe, my name etched clearly in cedar wood. Still, she kept talking like it was hers. The nameplate had been one of the very first things I'd installed after buying the place 6 months ago, a symbol of ownership and belonging that represented everything I'd worked for. Now it felt meaningless in the face of their confident assertions. Barbara barely acknowledged the nameplate, dismissing it with a casual wave like it was purely decorative, rather than legal proof of ownership and residence. Working at the county office, I deal with property paperwork all day long, processing deeds and titles and boundary disputes, so I know when something doesn't add up. I've seen every conceivable kind of property dispute and ownership confusion in my years of government work. The coordination between these two women, the way they had prepared answers for every question I asked, the fact that Emily already had contractors lined up before even discussing the matter with me. This wasn't confusion or miscommunication. This was orchestrated, carefully planned, and executed with military precision that suggested months of preparation. I watched Barbara's body language carefully when I asked direct questions about her legal authority, and she kept avoiding eye contact, looking over my shoulder or down at her clipboard. Emily's overconfidence felt rehearsed and practiced, like she'd gone through these conversations multiple times in front of a mirror. My professional instincts, honed by years of working with legal documents, were screaming that there was something much bigger happening here than what they were telling me, and my experience had taught me to trust those instincts when something felt fundamentally wrong. When Barbara thought I couldn't hear her clearly, she leaned over close to Emily and said something in a low voice that made my blood run cold. She told her sister that once they controlled this strategic spot, the shortcut access would finally become viable, and that 20 years of careful waiting were finally going to pay off. She said it with this satisfied, almost predatory smile, like someone who'd just executed the final move in a complex chess game they'd been playing for decades. I filed that comment away because it didn't align with anything they'd told me about community headquarters. What shortcut access, 20 years of waiting for? What exactly? I decided right then that I wasn't going to react emotionally or call the police immediately. My training in legal processes and property law kicked in, and I knew the smartest approach was to stay calm while I figured out exactly what kind of game they were playing before making my next strategic move. She tapped her perfectly manicured nails on the folder with obvious impatience. Check page 3. The transfer's already done. I opened it with growing dread. My stomach sank like a stone. That signature wasn't mine, but it looked disturbingly like it. Should I call the police now or wait to see just how deep this rabbit hole really goes? I spent the entire weekend digging through county records like a detective investigating a major crime, using my database access to pull everything I could find about our neighborhood's development history and HOA governance documents. The county office was empty except for the weekend security guard, giving me unrestricted access to filing systems and databases that most citizens never see. The silence was eerie, broken only by computer humming and occasional footsteps echoing down the hallway. And that's when I saw it, buried deep in municipal planning documents. The proposed exit ramp cutting straight across my property line like a surgical incision, buried in a zoning amendment filed exactly 3 months ago. Coincidence? Not a chance in hell. The timing was too perfect, the documentation too specific, and the financial implications too massive for this to be anything other than a carefully orchestrated land grab. I found that obscure provision from the 1960s about community resource reallocation, but it was clearly outdated legal language that had never been updated to reflect modern property law. More importantly, when I read through the entire document carefully, it specifically excluded private residences from any kind of community reallocation, without explicit owner consent and fair compensation. This meant Barbara's claims had absolutely no legal foundation whatsoever. But when I started overlaying the county's current development plans onto detailed neighborhood maps, something clicked into place that made my stomach drop. My lake cabin wasn't just valuable waterfront real estate. It was the absolutely critical junction point for a major highway access project worth millions in development contracts. The timing of Barbara's sudden interest in my property wasn't coincidental or driven by genuine community spirit. I pulled up the comprehensive highway development timeline and found that preliminary surveys were scheduled to begin within 6 months, with construction potentially starting within 2 years if approvals went through. Any property owner controlling that strategic junction would have enormous leverage in negotiating access rights and compensation, potentially worth hundreds of thousands in easement fees and development rights. This was about money, serious money, not community bulletin boards and neighborhood meetings. For a moment, I questioned my own memory and professional competence. Had I missed something crucial in the original sale documents? Was I slipping mentally? Or were they just that skillfully good at manufacturing confusion and self-doubt? The unsettling feeling was deeply disturbing because I'd always prided myself on meticulous attention to detail, especially with legal documents and property transactions. But the mounting evidence was becoming crystal clear that this had nothing to do with community headquarters or legitimate HOA authority. Barbara Henderson was methodically positioning herself to profit enormously from a massive development project, and my cabin represented the key piece she desperately needed. Tuesday evening, I received an official notice about an emergency HOA meeting scheduled for that very night. The rushed timing felt deliberately calculated, designed to catch residents off guard and limit organized opposition. When I arrived at the community center, Barbara had prepared what looked like a corporate presentation, with professional charts, color-coded graphs, and even a laser pointer. She'd transformed the casual community room into something resembling a Fortune 500 boardroom, complete with printed handouts, official binders for each board member, and a projection screen that must have cost more than most people's monthly rent. 2 more board members showed up that afternoon, and their behavior immediately set off alarm bells. One was casually holding what appeared to be a commercial-grade drone remote. The other asked me with straight-faced seriousness if I had proper permits for my solar panels. I didn't even have solar panels installed on my property. The questioning felt like systematic harassment disguised as official inquiry, clearly designed to create documentation that would support their narrative of code violations and community disruption. Every interaction was being recorded and cataloged, building an impressive paper trail that would supposedly justify their eventual property seizure through legitimate regulatory channels. Emily sat right beside Barbara, with a legal pad already sketching detailed floor plans for her headquarters renovation, like the decision had been made before the meeting officially began. Barbara's presentation was filled with corporate buzzwords about optimizing underutilized community assets and fulfilling neighborhood potential. But when you analyzed what she was saying, she never explained what any of it actually meant in concrete terms. I sat strategically in the back row, taking detailed notes and watching other board members' reactions, trying to understand the true depth of this conspiracy. Barbara delivered her obviously rehearsed speech about community growth and shared resource management using professional phrases that sounded official but meant nothing when subjected to critical analysis. She kept referring to comprehensive studies and community surveys that she never actually presented, and she spoke confidently about neighborhood consensus that clearly didn't exist because nobody had consulted me or most residents about these elaborate plans. The other board members looked visibly uncomfortable throughout the presentation, shifting nervously and avoiding eye contact, but significantly none spoke up to challenge her authority. I had already taken the precaution of emailing every record I possessed to myself and saving them in multiple secure locations. These people weren't just petty neighborhood bullies. They were methodical, organized, and clearly operating with sophisticated planning and significant resources. When Barbara finally opened the floor for questions, I stood up confidently with my comprehensive documentation and presented a systematic breakdown of exactly why her claims had no legal merit under current property law. I deliberately kept my tone completely professional and factual, which seemed to visibly irritate Barbara because I suspect she was hoping I'd become emotional and discredit myself. When I directly questioned the legal basis for her claimed authority, Barbara's demeanor shifted dramatically from friendly community leader to something much more calculating and aggressive. She announced with great ceremony a $500 per day fine for what she called HOA non-compliance, and established a firm deadline of exactly 1 week for my supposedly voluntary cooperation. The fine amount seemed completely arbitrary, and obviously punitive, clearly designed to financially pressure me into submission rather than addressing any legitimate community concerns. After the meeting concluded, I stayed in the parking lot and watched Barbara's behavior carefully. She positioned herself at the edge of the community center property, standing at the exact angle where she could stare directly at my lake cabin. She stood there for almost 10 minutes, occasionally taking photographs of sightlines and gesturing toward different areas of my property, like she was explaining architectural plans to invisible contractors. The whole performance felt rehearsed and purposeful, like she was already mentally visualizing the completed project and calculating expected profits. I thought I had them completely cornered with my evidence. The deed, the tax records, the insurance documentation, they were absolutely airtight and legally unassailable. Then Frank Peterson, the oldest neighbor on the ridge who'd lived here for decades, knocked urgently on my door. He looked genuinely pale and shaken. "You need to see this right away," he said with obvious concern. "They did this exact same thing before." So was I being paranoid, or was I finally seeing the real game she'd been playing all along? By Wednesday morning, I'd installed a comprehensive security system that would make a federal building jealous of its capabilities. Electronic locks with complex codes that only I knew, motion-activated cameras covering every angle of the property, perimeter sensors that would alert me if anyone approached within 50 feet, and infrared recording equipment that captured clear footage even in complete darkness. Everything was completely legal for private property protection under current state law, and I made sure to post appropriate warning signage about surveillance recording and clearly marked property boundaries that would eliminate any legal confusion about trespassing violations. I had a growing feeling that Emily was going to attempt something desperate soon. This wasn't just about holding defensive ground anymore against their harassment campaign. I needed to strike first, strategically, before they could rewrite the rules again, or manufacture new legal justifications for their property grab. So I called in a longtime friend from the district attorney's office who specialized in property fraud cases. We had some serious catching up to do about legal precedents and prosecution strategies. My contact there had extensive experience with organized property theft schemes and could provide invaluable guidance on building a prosecutable criminal case against systematic fraud operations. The conversation confirmed my growing suspicions that this situation was far more serious than typical neighborhood drama. By the third day of their campaign, the professional locksmiths had completely stopped showing up at my property. Emily stood pathetically by my front gate with folded arms and a Bluetooth headset, issuing increasingly desperate threats to nobody in particular while pacing back and forth like a caged animal. Her confident, entitled demeanor from the previous weekend had completely evaporated, replaced by obvious frustration and growing panic, as she slowly realized that her sister's grandiose promises weren't materializing into actual access to my property. Her phone calls became increasingly desperate, as professional contractors refused to break into private property without proper legal authorization. Thursday afternoon, Emily showed up expecting to begin her headquarters renovation project, and the look of absolute shock on her face when she discovered she couldn't get inside was genuinely priceless. My security system captured every second of her frustrated efforts in high-definition detail. She spent 20 minutes walking around the entire cabin, desperately pulling on doors and windows, getting increasingly agitated as she realized that her sister's confident assurances weren't going to materialize. When nothing worked despite her frantic efforts, she called Barbara in obvious panic, and I could clearly hear her voice getting higher and more desperate as she tried to explain the humiliating situation. Barbara arrived about an hour later with what she claimed was legitimate legal backup, but when I calmly presented my comprehensive ownership documentation and carefully explained the serious criminal liability they'd face for breaking into private property without proper court orders, they immediately refused to proceed. The head locksmith, who clearly had experience with property disputes, actually apologized to me for wasting my time and politely informed Barbara that she'd need authentic legal authorization before anyone would help her. Professional contractors recognize property disputes immediately and understand the substantial legal risks of getting involved without proper documentation. I had also proactively contacted all local utility companies with detailed ownership verification and created comprehensive paper trails preventing any unauthorized service interruptions that might be used as pressure tactics. My valuable connections at the county office helped expedite these important protections, ensuring that every utility provider had official documentation clearly showing that I was the sole authorized account holder for all services. If Barbara attempted to cut off essential services like electricity or water, she'd be committing additional serious felonies that would be straightforward to prosecute in court. I was systematically building an impenetrable fortress of legal protection around my property. I installed motion-triggered floodlights under the front porch that were sensitive enough to detect even small movements. When Barbara stepped too close during one of her reconnaissance missions that evening, the entire front lawn suddenly lit up like a professional stage or movie set. She visibly flinched and stumbled backward. I didn't even blink or react. The psychological impact was immediate and highly effective, clearly demonstrating that her attempts at intimidation and surveillance were being monitored, documented, and turned against her. Every trespass, every harassment attempt, every violation of my clearly marked property rights was being recorded in high definition with precise timestamps. That same evening, I spotted a black commercial-grade quadcopter buzzing suspiciously low near my dock, obviously conducting unauthorized surveillance of my property. I stepped outside calmly with a powerful flashlight and a garden hose at full pressure. The drone immediately swerved away from my property. Good choice by whoever was operating it. The sophisticated drone surveillance confirmed beyond any doubt that this wasn't amateur neighborhood harassment, but rather a well-coordinated operation with significant financial resources and advanced technical capabilities. Whoever was behind this elaborate scheme had invested serious money in professional equipment and detailed planning, which meant the potential financial payoff had to be enormous. I went deeper into county databases to understand exactly what was at stake financially in this property grab. The highway access development project that would cut through my lake cabin location would increase surrounding property values dramatically, but the biggest beneficiary by far would be Barbara's adjacent land holdings. According to detailed county assessments and development projections that I accessed through my official channels, successful development of that critical access road would increase Barbara's property value by an estimated $300,000 minimum. Her elaborate community headquarters story was just sophisticated cover for what amounted to the largest property theft scheme I'd ever encountered in my years of working with real estate law. Emily's growing panic was becoming more obvious and desperate every single day as she slowly realized the promises Barbara had made weren't going to materialize no matter how much she complained. She'd been promised something valuable that she couldn't actually access or control, and she was starting to ask Barbara increasingly uncomfortable questions about potential legal exposure and serious criminal liability. My comprehensive security cameras captured extensive footage of Barbara surveying my property after dark, like some kind of professional reconnaissance operative taking detailed measurements and photographing potential access routes with the methodical approach of someone planning a military operation. This was clear evidence of criminal trespassing and premeditation that would be absolutely invaluable if this situation escalated to formal court proceedings. I was meticulously documenting everything because I had a strong feeling this was far from over, and Barbara seemed like exactly the type of person who would keep escalating her illegal activities until she either got what she wanted or completely destroyed herself trying to achieve her goals. I was reviewing security footage from the west perimeter when I saw it clearly. Emily wasn't just pacing nervously around my property. She was on an animated phone call with someone who definitely wasn't Barbara, someone I recognized from a completely different courtroom. Watching her pace around my property in the dark, like some kind of stalker, should I feel scared or sorry for her, because she had absolutely no idea what was coming next. Barbara's next move was to launch a neighborhood whisper campaign, designed to isolate me socially and pressure me into giving up. Suddenly, I was the antisocial troublemaker who was harming community values and blocking neighborhood progress. Several neighbors who had been friendly before started avoiding me or making awkward small talk that felt forced and uncomfortable. The change was subtle but unmistakable, like someone had flipped a switch and turned me into the neighborhood pariah overnight. I noticed the changed atmosphere immediately during my evening walks around the lake. Strained greetings avoided eye contact, hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when I approached. The psychological pressure was subtle but constant, and I could see how it might wear down someone who didn't understand what was really happening behind the scenes. One neighbor, Janice, crossed the street when she saw me walking. Another sent an anonymous letter telling me to stop ruining the HOA's vision. I realized this wasn't just Barbara anymore. This was fear working its way through the cul-de-sac. The manipulation was spreading like a virus, turning ordinary people into unwitting accomplices in Barbara's scheme. She'd weaponized community spirit and transformed neighborly concern into a tool for harassment and intimidation. The worst part was watching people I'd considered friends become participants in something they didn't fully understand. After a particularly tense neighborhood gathering, where people barely acknowledged my presence, Frank Peterson approached me privately in the parking lot. Frank was this elderly guy with gray hair who'd lived in the neighborhood for decades, and he had a reputation for keeping to himself and observing everything without getting involved in drama. He was the kind of neighbor who knew everyone's business but never gossiped about it, the type who noticed patterns that other people missed. Instead of the usual complaints or awkward small talk, Frank simply looked me in the eye with this serious expression and said, "She tried this exact same thing before, Miller family back in 2002. That one sentence changed everything I thought I knew about Barbara Henderson and her methods. Frank reached into his glove box and pulled out a faded manila folder. "I kept this, just in case," he muttered. Inside were copies of old complaint forms, notes about mysterious violations, even a grainy photograph of Barbara yelling at Mrs. Miller's teenage son in their driveway. "She had the same smile back then," Frank added. "The one that says, 'I've already won.'" The documentation was extensive and methodical, showing a pattern of harassment that stretched back decades. Frank had been quietly collecting evidence of Barbara's abuses, understanding that someday someone would need proof of her systematic criminal behavior. Frank explained that Barbara had previously attempted to claim authority over the Miller family's property using fabricated HOA justifications and forged documentation. The county had investigated after the Millers fought back, and they'd found systematic abuse of administrative power, including harassment, false claims of authority, and attempted property interference. Barbara had received a formal warning and a 10-year prohibition from any involvement in property development or access issues within the county. The prohibition had been specifically designed to prevent exactly the kind of scheme she was now trying to pull on me. The kicker was that her prohibition period had expired just 3 months before she started targeting my cabin. Following Frank's lead, I accessed county violation records and found Barbara's complete legal history spread across multiple files and databases. Formal warnings, documented harassment complaints, and a prohibition order that specifically mentioned her pattern of using false HOA authority to interfere with property rights and intimidate homeowners into compliance. She'd been systematically planning this scheme for years, waiting for her legal restrictions to expire, before targeting the most strategically valuable property in the neighborhood. The woman wasn't just delusional or power-hungry. She was a calculated repeat offender who'd learned to be more careful about covering her tracks and creating plausible legal cover for her crimes. I felt this mix of anger and shame crawling under my skin. I'd thought I was the first, that this was personal, but it wasn't. Barbara had turned property theft into a playbook, and I was just her latest attempt. The realization that I wasn't special, that I was just another victim in a long line of targets, was both humbling and infuriating. How many other families had she destroyed? How many people had given up rather than fighting someone who seemed to have unlimited confidence and official-looking paperwork? I started building a comprehensive case file with everything I'd discovered, organizing it like the legal proceeding I suspected was coming. Property documentation, harassment, evidence, county violation, history, development, value analysis, and security footage of her trespassing incidents. My supervisor at the county office remembered Barbara's previous violations when I mentioned her name, and he advised me that repeat offenders get serious scrutiny in our jurisdiction. The institutional support was encouraging, but I was also starting to understand just how dangerous Barbara could become when her carefully laid plans started falling apart. She'd invested too much time and effort into this scheme to give up easily. Emily's doubt was becoming more visible every day as she watched Barbara's increasingly desperate behavior and my methodical professional responses. She started pressing Barbara for legal justification and concrete timelines, but Barbara's evasive answers only increased Emily's anxiety about potential criminal exposure. I could see Emily starting to realize that she'd been used as a pawn in a scheme that could result in serious criminal charges for both of them. The sister dynamic was shifting as Emily began to understand that Barbara had put her in legal jeopardy without fully explaining the risks. With historical context and institutional support, I developed a comprehensive strategy to expose Barbara's scheme through proper legal channels rather than trying to handle it myself. I had transformed from a defensive property owner who was just trying to protect his cabin into a strategic investigator with powerful evidence and official backing. Frank's revelation had given me the missing piece of the puzzle, and now I understood that Barbara's current behavior was just the latest chapter in a long history of property-related crimes. The question was whether I had enough evidence to stop her permanently this time, or if she'd just wait another 10 years and try again with someone else. The pattern suggested she wasn't going to stop until someone made her stop. Barbara had perfected her methods over decades, learning from each previous attempt and refining her approach to avoid the mistakes that had gotten her caught before. She was like a virus that had evolved to become more resistant to legal antibiotics, more sophisticated in her methods of infection and manipulation. That night, someone knocked on my cabin door. Not hard, just 2 soft taps like a warning. When I opened it, there was nothing but a manila envelope. Inside, a copy of Barbara's original prohibition order and a fresh HOA violation notice dated tomorrow. Staring at that thick file of evidence, I felt like I was holding a loaded gun. The question was, did I have the guts to pull the trigger? Recognizing that my position was getting stronger every day, Barbara intensified her harassment campaign to new levels that bordered on obsessive stalking. She started orchestrating noise complaints against my cabin, scheduling unnecessary property inspections, and encouraging neighbors to report invented violations for everything from landscaping to parking. At this point, my front door was a bulletin board of fake authority, cited for aggressive gardening one day and emotional landscaping the next. She was trying to bury me in bureaucratic harassment, hoping I'd get exhausted and give up, rather than fight every single frivolous charge. But what Barbara didn't realize was that I treated each harassment incident as additional evidence for my growing legal case, carefully documenting every single violation notice and complaint with photographs and timestamps. I documented every single incident with meticulous precision, creating spreadsheets that tracked timestamps, witness statements, and photographic evidence of each harassment attempt. My systematic approach was building an unassailable legal foundation that would be impossible for Barbara to explain away in court proceedings. I created detailed charts showing patterns of escalation, frequency analysis of complaint types, and correlation data between my documentation activities and increased harassment attempts. The contrast between her increasingly erratic behavior and my professional documentation was becoming stark, and I could see that even her supporters were starting to question her methods and wonder if they'd gotten involved in something much more serious than neighborhood politics. Emily's confidence was collapsing as she watched her sister's behavior become more desperate and obvious with each passing day. She'd gone from confidently planning headquarters renovations to nervously asking Barbara about exit strategies and legal protection that didn't exist. The transformation was visible and disturbing, like watching someone slowly realize they had been manipulated into participating in something that could destroy their future. Emily started making phone calls to attorneys, researching criminal liability, and asking increasingly pointed questions about Barbara's assurances that everything was perfectly legal and above board. Based on my documented complaints and Barbara's violation history, the county planning department issued a formal warning about administrative harassment and property interference patterns. The official letter arrived on county letterhead with legal terminology that made it clear this wasn't just a friendly suggestion or administrative reminder. An inspector from the Department of Public Records even called me directly. "We've had our eye on this HOA for a while," he said. "Yours isn't the first complaint, just the most detailed." That's when I realized my paper trail wasn't just evidence. It was precedent. The county had been building a case against Barbara's pattern of abuse, and my documentation was providing the missing pieces they needed. When Emily saw that county warning letter, her face went completely white, and she confronted Barbara about criminal liability for the first time since this whole scheme had started. The county warning specifically mentioned potential criminal charges for harassment and property interference language that Emily understood meant serious legal consequences that could include jail time and substantial financial penalties. Barbara's dismissive responses and refusal to explain their legal protections shattered Emily's remaining confidence in the scheme. I wasn't sure if I should feel bad for Emily getting caught in her sister's mess or if she deserved whatever was coming for going along with attempted property theft. I assembled a complete legal package that would serve as my nuclear option if Barbara pushed things any further. The file included ownership documentation, harassment timeline, with supporting evidence, county violation records, property value, analysis, security footage, and witness statements from concerned neighbors who were finally starting to speak up about years of intimidation. The other HOA board members were beginning to distance themselves from Barbara's actions, as county officials became aware of the situation and started asking questions about HOA governance and decision-making processes. Her power base was eroding as people realized they could face legal exposure for supporting her scheme. The psychological advantage had shifted completely in my favor through patient documentation and professional legal process. I maintained calm professionalism while Barbara became increasingly desperate and visible in her rule-breaking and harassment. Neighbors were witnessing the contrast between my measured responses and Barbara's escalating desperation, and public opinion was shifting as people recognized the manipulation they'd been experiencing for years. Frank Peterson had started talking to other long-term residents about Barbara's history, and stories were emerging about previous harassment and intimidation that people had been afraid to discuss before. A pattern of abuse was becoming clear to everyone who had been too intimidated to speak up previously. Barbara's reign of terror had been built on fear and isolation, preventing victims from comparing notes and recognizing the systematic nature of her criminal behavior. But now that people were talking openly, the scope of her crimes was becoming undeniable. Property owners who'd given up and moved away, families who'd been driven out through harassment businesses that had been targeted for refusing to pay protection money disguised as HOA fees. Emily became my unlikely intelligence source, as her terror of legal consequences made her more talkative about Barbara's private admissions and long-term planning. She revealed that Barbara had bragged about highway development profits and expressed complete disregard for property rights and legal boundaries when she thought she was talking privately to family. Emily was realizing that her sister had been using her as a pawn in a scheme that could result in serious criminal charges, and she was starting to panic about her own legal exposure and potential criminal liability as an accomplice to fraud and property theft. All the elements were aligning for decisive legal action, with me holding overwhelming evidence and Barbara's support structure collapsing around her, as people understood the true scope of her criminal behavior. The county warning had also triggered additional scrutiny from other departments, and I learned that building inspectors and code enforcement officers were now aware of the situation and watching for any additional harassment or retaliation attempts. Barbara's pattern of using official-looking documents and false authority claims had finally attracted the attention of people who could take real action against her. The institutional machinery was starting to move, and once that process began, it would be very difficult for Barbara to stop or control the outcome through intimidation and manipulation. Her years of avoiding consequences through fear and false authority were coming to an end as real legal professionals took notice of her systematic criminal behavior. The paper trail I'd created was providing prosecutors with exactly the kind of evidence they needed to build an airtight case. Emily showed up at my cabin that night uninvited. Her mascara was running. "She said if I turn on her, I'm next," she whispered. Then she looked at my camera by the porch light. "Did it catch this scene every second?" I said. She nodded. "Then maybe I do have a way out." Looking at Emily's scared face as she read that county letter, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But was it too late for her to save herself? County officials scheduled formal proceedings regarding HOA authority abuse for the following Tuesday morning at the main administrative building downtown. The hearing room was designed for serious legal matters with official seals and recording equipment that made it clear this wasn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore. I arrived with legal representation, my comprehensive evidence file organized in professional binders and witness testimony from Frank Peterson and several affected neighbors who'd finally found the courage to speak up about Barbara's years of intimidation and harassment. The atmosphere was formal and serious, nothing like the community center meetings where Barbara had been able to control the narrative and intimidate people into silence. Barbara maintained her authoritative demeanor despite the mounting evidence against her, presenting fabricated community support documents and claiming legitimate HOA jurisdiction over private property. She actually seemed to believe that her confidence in official-sounding language would be enough to convince county officials that she was in the right. Her red blazer was perfectly pressed, her blonde bob styled immaculately, and she carried herself like someone who'd never faced real consequences for her actions in decades of manipulating neighborhood politics and intimidating vulnerable homeowners into submission. Our presentation unfolded like a trap. Each document snapped shut on a lie, ownership proof, surveillance footage, motive laid bare in property value maps. The hearing officer took detailed notes and asked pointed questions that made it clear the county was taking this situation very seriously and had experience dealing with similar cases of authority abuse and property fraud. Barbara's confident facade started cracking as she realized that official county proceedings operated by different rules than neighborhood intimidation. I should have felt triumph. Instead, there was something hollow in her eyes, like she knew this wasn't her final defeat, like she had practiced losing before. The realization was unsettling because it suggested that Barbara viewed this hearing not as a decisive conclusion, but as another step in a longer game that I didn't fully understand yet. Her calmness in the face of overwhelming evidence wasn't resignation, but calculation, and that made me wonder what other schemes she might have in motion. Under direct questioning about document authenticity, Emily's facade completely crumbled, like a house of cards in a windstorm. Terrified of criminal charges and desperate to save herself from prosecution, she revealed Barbara's private confessions about highway development schemes and her admitted intentions to steal my property for personal profit. Emily's testimony was devastating because she provided insider details about Barbara's planning process, her complete disregard for legal boundaries, and her long-term strategy for manipulating neighborhood politics to enable property theft. The major twist came when county legal analysts examined Barbara's donation authorization document more closely under proper legal scrutiny. What Barbara had intended as proof of her authority to transfer my property actually constituted attempted fraud under state law, complete with forged signatures and false legal claims. Creating false ownership transfer documents with intent to deprive legitimate owners of their properties is a felony-level offense in our jurisdiction, carrying potential prison time and substantial financial penalties. Barbara's own elaborate paperwork became direct evidence of premeditated fraud. Her proof destroyed her case completely, and you could see the moment she realized what had happened and how completely she'd incriminated herself through her own manufactured evidence. The legal analysts explained in detail how each forged signature, each falsified date, each manufactured authorization constituted a separate criminal act that would be prosecuted individually. Barbara's face went pale as the full scope of her legal exposure became clear, but she still maintained that defiant posture that suggested she believed she could somehow talk her way out of consequences. Faced with criminal fraud charges, documented violation patterns, and Emily's damaging testimony, Barbara's authoritative persona disintegrated into desperate denials and contradictory explanations that only made her look more guilty. She started claiming that Emily had misunderstood her intentions, that the documents were just preliminary drafts, and that everything had been taken out of context by people who didn't understand HOA governance. But the evidence was too comprehensive and well documented for her explanations to hold any water with officials who dealt with property law every day. The hearing officer delivered comprehensive consequences that exceeded even my expectations for justice in this case. Immediate removal from the HOA board with a lifetime ban from any HOA leadership position, criminal fraud referral to the district attorney's office, civil liability for property harassment and attempted theft, financial responsibility for my legal costs and damages, and a restraining order preventing any further contact with me or my property. Neighbors who had attended the hearing witnessed Barbara's complete professional and personal destruction, and the manipulation and intimidation they'd experienced was finally exposed and officially condemned. The systematic nature of her crimes was now part of the official record, and other victims could use this precedent to seek their own justice against similar schemes. The hearing had exposed not just Barbara's current attempt at property theft, but decades of systematic abuse that had been hidden through fear and intimidation. Frank Peterson's evidence folder had provided the historical context that transformed this from an isolated incident into a pattern of criminal behavior that demanded serious consequences. Emily completely severed all ties with Barbara to avoid criminal conspiracy charges and potential prosecution as an accomplice. She publicly repudiated her sister's actions and provided additional evidence of Barbara's systematic rule violations and harassment patterns that went back years and affected dozens of families. Watching the two sisters turn on each other was almost surreal, but I understood that Emily was trying to save herself from going down with Barbara's sinking ship. The family relationship was probably destroyed forever. As the county clerk read the official ruling, Barbara didn't flinch. She just stared at me, no rage, no pleading, just calculation, as if her next move had already begun. As they led Barbara out of that hearing room, I should have felt victorious. So why did I have this nagging feeling that she still had one last card to play? The district attorney proceeded with fraud prosecution based on the county's referral and the overwhelming evidence from our hearing that made conviction almost certain. Faced with the prospect of a lengthy trial and almost certain conviction on multiple felony charges, Barbara accepted a plea agreement that included community service, a $5,000 fine, 2 years of probation, and a permanent criminal record that would follow her for the rest of her life. The community service was particularly fitting because she'd have to spend 200 hours actually helping the neighborhood instead of trying to exploit it for personal gain. 2 weeks after her criminal conviction, I received lawsuit papers from Barbara claiming defamation and emotional distress, seeking $50,000 in compensation for damage to her reputation and emotional trauma. Her attorney warned her that it was a frivolous action with no legal merit, but Barbara insisted on proceeding anyway, despite the additional legal costs and risk of sanctions. I think her ego couldn't handle the idea that she'd been completely defeated, and she needed one last attempt to salvage some kind of victory from the wreckage of her scheme. The courtroom battle was even more devastating than the original hearing, if that was even possible. My attorney presented Barbara's entire documented history of fraud, harassment, false claims, and systematic abuse of authority going back decades. The judge reviewed her recent criminal conviction, her pattern of legal violations, her complete lack of credible evidence for her defamation claims, and her history of frivolous legal actions designed to intimidate victims. Barbara's lawsuit wasn't just dismissed. It was ruled frivolous and malicious, and the judge imposed additional sanctions. Barbara didn't lose quietly. She exploded, clawing at the system she once manipulated, and the system this time pushed back with full force. My attorney filed malicious prosecution charges as a countersuit, and the judge awarded me additional damages totaling $15,000, plus a permanent contact prohibition that would be enforced through criminal penalties if violated. The judge's statement became neighborhood legend when he told Barbara that her pattern of abuse, fraud, and continued harassment represented everything wrong with unchecked authority. Between criminal fines, civil judgments, legal fees, and countersuit damages, Barbara faced financial obligations exceeding $40,000. Her scheme to steal my property and profit from highway development had cost her everything she'd hoped to gain and destroyed her financial future in the process. The irony was perfect because she'd ended up paying me more money than she would have made from her original fraud, while simultaneously ensuring that she could never benefit from the highway development she'd tried to steal from me. Afterward, Mrs. Chang from Lot 14 handed me a note. It simply read, "You gave us courage." I didn't realize how many had been waiting for someone to stand up first. The ripple effects of standing up to Barbara extended far beyond my own property dispute, inspiring other victims of her abuse to come forward and seek their own justice. Stories emerged from families who had been driven out of the neighborhood businesses that had been targeted for refusing to pay protection money disguised as HOA fees. Emily's complete transformation was probably the most surprising outcome of the whole situation, and it gave me some hope for human nature, despite everything I'd witnessed. Forced into employment for the first time in her adult life, to pay her share of the legal judgments, she found work at the local Department of Motor Vehicles and discovered that having real responsibilities actually gave her life purpose and meaning. The experience of nearly facing criminal charges had completely changed her entitled worldview into something resembling responsible citizenship. She even apologized to me months later, admitting that she'd been living in a fantasy world where consequences didn't apply to her and other people's property could be taken without permission. The transformation was genuine and dramatic, suggesting that some people can change when faced with real consequences for their actions. Emily had gone from being a willing accomplice in property theft to becoming a productive member of society who understood the value of honest work. The perfect ironic resolution came 6 months later when the county approved the highway access project with me as a legitimate stakeholder in the development process. Through proper legal channels and transparent negotiations based on actual property rights rather than fraud, I received $200,000 in fair compensation for development easement rights on my property. I'd earned legitimately exactly what Barbara had tried to steal through fraud, and she was legally prohibited from benefiting from any aspect of the project. The development proceeded smoothly because it was based on honest negotiations rather than criminal schemes, and everyone involved benefited from the legitimate legal process. Property values in the area increased for all homeowners, new jobs were created by the construction project, and the improved highway access made our community more attractive to businesses and families looking for a peaceful place to live. Using my settlement proceeds, I renovated my cabin with beautiful landscaping and pathway improvements that genuinely enhanced neighborhood appeal and property values for everyone, not just myself. The Barbara Henderson case became county precedent for prosecuting HOA authority abuse, and her criminal conviction serves as a warning to other potential authority abusers throughout the region. The legal precedent has been cited in dozens of subsequent cases involving HOA fraud and property theft. On peaceful weekend mornings, I enjoy coffee on my cabin porch, watching children safely use the new community pathway funded by my legitimate development participation. It's a perfect example of how things work when they're done honestly and legally, rather than through fraud and intimidation. Barbara's scheme backfired, completely enabling my financial success while destroying her own future prospects entirely. Sometimes the best way to defeat a bully is simply letting them destroy themselves while you do everything the right way. And as I sip my coffee on the porch, looking at that rusty clipboard bolted under the plaque, I can't help but smile. That thing used to symbolize threats. Now, it's just a relic, proof that justice can leave scars on the villain too. Maybe the real lesson here is when you build on lies, the collapse is only a matter of time. If you're still here, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever seen karma show up this perfectly? And if you liked this one and want to support the channel, you can always hit the little thanks button below. Thanks for hanging out.
Another wild tale courtesy of QA Stories. If your jaw's on the floor, you're in the right place. Subscribe and stay shocked.